Hi Earthlings, I hope you're doing well. So this is just to introduce a talk that I did in Istanbul at the International Istanbul Vegfest. And I just extracted my talk out of it to let you have a little look. And it's my usual talk about the pioneers of the social movement. So you'll see that there's the kind of advert that I did for the festival, and then a very nice and generous introduction from Denise. So thank you again for that. And then the talk itself with a bit of a Q&A at the end. You know, learning the history of the movement, I've always thought is very important, and also the correct thing to do when you join one, I tend to think. But anyway, so here we go. And I hope you enjoy this, and give me some feedback in the comments if you will. Thanks a lot. Hi Earthlings, my name is Roger Yates of the Vegan Information Project in Dublin. This year I'm talking at the International Istanbul Vegfest, which takes place on July the 3rd and July the 4th. My talk is going to be about the people who started the vegan social movement, their values and their aspirations.
Hello, everyone. My name is Denise. I hope you can hear me. There's some background noise. I'm very excited to be introducing you to Roger Yates. He will speak about the pioneers of the vegan movement, and I think it's safe to say that Roger is one of the best people to introduce you to the founding principles of the vegan movement. Roger is based in Dublin and has been involved in the movement, I think, at least since the 70s. And he's been active in various roles in the animal rights movement, one of them being the press liaison for the Animal Liberation Front. He's also a lecturer in sociology, and he's currently busy organizing for the Dublin-based Vegan Information Project, and he's also co-founder of the Animal Rights Show, a weekly online program which you can see on YouTube. I highly recommend you check that out. I myself learned a lot from Roger's content, and I think it's safe to say that he's one of the people who influenced me most as an activist. So I'm particularly delighted to be welcoming Roger to our Vegfest. Hi, Roger. Thank you so much for being here. You can turn on your camera and microphone and everything right now. There you are.
Just about. How are you doing?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
Put some lights on as well. So I'm going to try and share my screen on this other computer, so hopefully we can get the technology working.
Awesome. I'll wait for that.
So there it should go. And that should be full screen.
Beautiful. Perfect. I'll be in the background. I'll turn off my camera, and if you need me, I'll be here.
Okay, thank you very much. So welcome everyone. Thanks so much for coming along. And I just got a text from one of my co-hosts of the Animal Rights Show saying, go on then, follow that, follow the fairy tale. So that's going to be quite a difficult thing to do. So this is a talk I've done quite a while. I'm going to kind of slim it down really for time reasons. And so we'll probably dash through things a little bit quickly. So if you want the actual slideshow, then you can see the email at the bottom there, roger.yates@ucd.ie. You're welcome to write to me there and I shall send it to you. I obviously want to thank the organizers for inviting me and organizing this amazing event thus far, and particularly the translators and the tech people. I know they're doing a heck of a lot of work in the background, so thanks very much to everyone who's making all this possible. So this indeed really is kind of like introducing people to their own movement in a way. So I'm talking about the vegan social movement. So I'm not talking about the people who may have been on a plant-based diet for many years, or people who thought about human other animal relations, anything like that. I'm talking about the people who came together as an organized effort to create the vegan movement. So they created the vegan social movement. They named the movement veganism, and they also started a social movement organization, which was called the Vegan Society. So they are the kind of people that I'm talking about, essentially. This is Matthew Cole, who's a fellow sociologist, and he talks about the breathtaking scope of veganism and vegan pioneers, really. And so that's what my talk is essentially about. But I want to pick out this little bit, which is from Donald Watson. He basically was saying to people, if you understand the history of your movement, then it's easier for you then to be faithful to the values of the movement. That's essentially what Watson is saying here. I think that's very important. I think if people are going to join a social movement, they have a kind of duty to find out about its values. And that doesn't mean that they can't disagree with them, because social movements do evolve and they do change, they move, social movements. And so that's not a problem. It's a question of whether people come in and, as it were, make up the social movement on the hoof, you know, just in terms of their own values, rather than talking about the values of the people. So it is important that we look back to the history of our movement in order to recognize its importance and its scope. And the value of that is because the vegan movement is an amazing thing. It's an absolutely massive idea. And the people who started it were real revolutionaries. They were real radicals of their time. And so this is a little kind of slide that kind of goes through a little bit of that. I'm not going to go through it in great detail. I usually spend a lot of time on this, but I won't. But we're talking about a movement that was founded in 1944. And that meant that it was during the Second World War, global conflict. And I always like to say that the vegans declared peace during this global conflict. They were trying to work out why humanity was so violent towards each other. So they saw themselves as part of the peace movement. They saw themselves as part of a justice movement, and they stood obviously for non-violence. And that was across the board. So I always say that the veganism stands, you can summarize it as a justice for all movement. And a central part of that is this bit at the bottom, which is about the moral evolution of humanity. They thought that vegan values would mean that we, as the human race, if you like, would evolve morally. And so if we adopted a vegan world with vegan values, then there'll be much less violence right across the board. And just a little note about language. I'm going to show you some quotes from going back to the 50s and 60s and 70s, etc. The language is quite sexist. They are a product of their time, so we have to kind of allow them that a little bit, if you like. And so, you know, they will talk about man instead of humanity, that kind of thing. So some of their language we'll find a little bit odd now, but that's because of when they were writing, essentially. That's what I'm saying. Now, there are some chat at the moment about how white and male the movement is, and that is an issue, certainly in terms of the new prominent influences in the movement. But the good news, I suppose, is that women have been a substantial part of the movement all the time, and there's always been strong and powerful women, not least the people who started the vegan social movement. And these are four of those people. Elsie Shrigley, also called Sally Shrigley. There was a time when people thought that she may have been the person who coined the word veganism. Turns out that Dorothy Watson and Donald Watson were the people who did that. Eva Batt, we're going to see a great quote from Eva Batt in a few minutes. And she's actually famous for writing some early vegan cookbooks. Not the first ones, but some of the best sellers, if you like. But she also did a pamphlet called Why Vegan? I'm going to come back to that. And the most impressive person, most interesting person from this list, in a way, is probably Kathleen Janaway. She was very influential in the early years of the vegan movement. And then in the 1980s, she broke away and started a group called Movement for Compassionate Living. And in fact, I've got one of their pamphlets right here from the 1990s. And they had a very radical view of the future. You could even call it anarchic, but very kind of radical and revolutionary. I'm not going to read these out from Janaway, but at the top, she's saying essentially that politicians are followers and not leaders, and they follow the votes, and they follow the money, and so do the industrialists. So it's a kind of supply and demand thing. When we bring about cultural change, then the politicians and the industrialists will change. And then the bottom quote is very radical. The present over-industrialized system degrades people to machine slaves and to programmed consumers of machine products. An incredibly radical thing to say back in the 1990s. And their vision was of tree-based autonomous vegan villages. And it's online. If you want to look up Movement for Compassionate Living, you can see that. Also, there's a Vegfest UK series called And If You Know Your History, and there's an article about Kathleen Janaway there as well. Right, so this is in a way the beginning of the talk. This is a summary from 1990s, looking back, if you like, from Kath Clements. Now, the interesting thing about this is that until about 6-7 years ago maximum, really, this statement would not have been controversial within the movement. It would have been a kind of given in a way. It's a little bit more controversial now to say that veganism is about having a consistent approach to human rights and animal rights, ecology, which we would now call environmentalism, and world food problems, which we would now call food security issues. So this is really a summary of vegan values as set out by the people who started our movement. And so we're going to see that in a sense with what's to come. This is the Eva Batt quote that I mentioned. This is 64, a little pamphlet, a little booklet called Why Veganism? Veganism is one thing and one thing only, a way of living which avoids exploitation. Those being exploited are fellow men, humanity, the animal population, the other animals, and the soil. I always think it's quite interesting that they conceived of the soil as being exploitable, but we kind of know what they mean. In fact, in the 1980s, this came back into our movement through a book called Diet for a New America by John Robbins. So that's an interesting book in itself. And so again, what we've got here is this entangled idea, this kind of intertwining of issues, which is central to the core of what veganism means, and certainly meant for the people in the movement. As I said, these ideas are not controversial. It wasn't controversial when I joined the movement in the 1970s, and certainly wasn't controversial for the people in the 1940s who began our movement. It's become controversial, if you like, a little bit earlier on, later on in the last few years. So this is Donald Watson. Now, Watson is the best known of the co-founders of the vegan social movement, and he's writing here 1 year after the movement was founded in 1945. He's basically answering a question. In fact, I think this sentence is probably better than the current official vegan society definition personally, but it says the object of the vegan society is to oppose the exploitation of sentient life. Again, this across the board idea, whether it is profitable to do so or not. That end bit, we could, if we wanted to, maybe read in an anti-capitalist kind of idea into that. I tend to kind of think it might have been, but certainly this is a kind of bold statement of vegan values, I always tend to think, from 1945. Now, this is where we get some kind of arrogance, perhaps, from Donald Watson, because he argued that the vegan movement was the greatest movement that ever was. That's where Matthew Cole got his chapter from. So I made a meme of this. It's not particularly good, but this is a meme that I made anyway, because essentially, Watson thought that veganism was such a wonderful, big idea, such a big radical idea. It was like an overarching principle for everyone. And he recognized that there were other social movements, but he saw them as lesser movements. That's the kind of arrogant bit, if you like. And he used this metaphor and cliche about the Titanic. He said that whilst, the vegans are putting the searchlight on on the iceberg, as it were. The lesser movements are just rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. And really, we need to have a bigger, more radical idea about what's needed to change. Essentially, what's needed to change is humanity. Watson said that veganism was the only movement that could save humanity. Again, quite a big, and if you like, utopian, if you like, arrogant claim, but that's how they saw it. This is Watson again from 1947. And so I just pick out a few things from this. He's basically saying that if vegan values came to pass, it would represent the greatest peaceful revolution ever known. And who would benefit? In the better interests of humanity and the other animals alike. So again, we're seeing this theme being rehearsed and propagated over and over again, that our liberation is their liberation. Their liberation is our liberation. It's all entwined, or in David Nybert's terms, it's all entangled. That oppression and liberation are entangled ideas, which is what David Nybert and other sociologists said. Now, this is Jack Sanderson. This is quite interesting. This is this guy was the editor of The Vegan, the official journal of the Vegan Society, and he's again looking back, but this is from the mid-1960s, and he's talking about how Donald Watson kind of, set the flame, started the ball rolling, if you like. But again, he made this same claim. He said that if vegan values came into being, then that would erase from the face of the earth all the wrong exploitation of the collective life of the earth. So who did he mean? That of the creatures. See, we wouldn't say that now, creatures perhaps, and the plants, and that of man. So yet again, a really big claim about these entangled ideas. Vegan values are about justice for all. We liberate ourselves by liberating other animals and also looking after, if you like, the planet, and to some degree, even down to making sure that the soil is okay. Okay, there's a few slides here from Leslie Cross. Leslie Cross is a very important figure in the vegan movement, and Donald Watson actually says that himself, along with someone called Arthur Ling, who doesn't really feature in this talk. But Leslie Cross was the person who pointed out in the 1950s that veganism didn't really have a definition. The vegan diet did, but veganism as a philosophical idea didn't. And so that's what they set about doing. Now, this slide is about the changes that would come with veganism, which are obvious and not so obvious. So the obvious changes, and he says this in the second paragraph, there'll be no butchers, there'll be milkmen, men, still on their rounds, but they will be delivering vegan milk. The countryside would not have to bear mother cows crying for their young. There'd be no slaughterhouses, no vivisection laboratories, and no one would hunt other animals anymore. So they're the obvious things that we talk about, which you could say is the focus of the movement. These are the less than obvious things, which are what I call the scope. So I get the idea of focus and scope really from Leslie Cross. Some of the changes are not so obvious. The benefits to man himself, again, this sexist language, of living in a kindlier and more enlightened world can be envisaged only in a broadest outline. There's no great blueprint to what the world, a vegan world would look like, but we've got the idea that it would be good and it would be non-violent. His health, physical and mental, will be vastly improved. Now, this is very important. Now, probably every vegan watching this probably knows the burden of being vegan in a non-vegan world. It's kind of quite traumatic, this burden of living in a speciesist world, which is deeply culturally speciesist, where other animals are treated like property and their rights are violated on a second by second basis. All that in this vision of the future will be lifted. It will be like our liberation as well as their liberation. So this is why we've got these, intertwined ideas being rehearsed over and over. Finally, on that, Cross does say, we are the pioneers, which is quite interesting. I always say that we're probably still in the pioneer stage when it comes to veganism. This is veganism. This is Cross from 54. And this one is really talking about rights. So I'm gonna reluctantly, because I usually make a big fuss about this one, but I'm gonna kind of jump past this one. Again, if you want this thing, just email me. Now, this is the slide from 1951, which really nails down this idea of focus and scope. And again, we've kind of got in the first paragraph the focus, what is obvious about veganism, and that's the thing. Again, he's talking about food, commodities, hunting, vivisection, all the uses that we put other animals to. That's going to be gone. But then he says the second broad aspect, the scope, in other words, is what veganism would do to human evolution. So we're back to this idea of moral evolution, that we're going to evolve as a species by adopting veganism. And he says this: until the present relationship between humanity and other animals is replaced by one of companionship on a relatively equal footing, the pursuit of happiness by humans is foredoomed to a tragic and painful frustration. So we're not going to get anything that we might want if we want peace and non-violence, if we continue to be non-peaceful and violent towards other animals. This is just kind of not going to happen. This is the final one, I think, from Cross. And again, this is where he says that veganism is not so much about animal welfare, it's about animal liberation. Who would be liberated? Well, again, the creatures, the other animals, and the mind and the heart of humanity. So again, this thing is said over and over again. Because he would free himself from many of his demands of his lower nature, we wouldn't talk in those terms perhaps nowadays, the benefit to man himself would be incalculable. They're making some big claims, these early vegans. They're saying that a vegan world would be absolutely brilliant for everybody. It would be non-violent. You know, there should be no domestic violence, no sexual violence. There should be no interhuman violence. If we stop being violent towards the planet and to other animals, we should then in turn be non-violent towards each other, and we would have a much better world. And I think as vegans, we would probably agree with that. So getting near to the end now, this is Matthew Cole again, and he's talking about, it really is putting all of what was said then, he's putting that into language that we understand in a way. He's talking about the aims of veganism, combines compassionate non-exploitation of other animals with an emancipated vegan self and a more compassionate human society. That's really kind of what's been said. That's generally what veganism stands for. It would be this all-encompassing idea which would lead to a different world in which non-violence would prevail. Now, I tend to cheat a little bit here, and I tend to ask and answer the first two questions. So forgive me for that. I'll do this very quickly. Didn't the vegan pioneers, especially Watson, talk a lot about health and diet? The answer to that is yes. So this is what sometimes people confuse. They think, well, veganism is about diet. No, the reason that they talked about health at the beginning is that everyone told them, that their doctors told them, the vegetarians told them that they were going to die. The orthodoxy at the time was that human beings could not live without animal products. So they had to prove that bit, as it were, first. So that was a preoccupation. And so Watson got deeply involved with all that. And then people like Cross and Janaway came in and developed the vegan philosophy. And haven't we been doing vegan education for many decades? The answer to that is no. The way that we think about veganism now as a moral baseline, as central to everything that we say and really everything we do, is new. It's a 21st century thing. So vegan education as we know it, as people watching this probably understand it, that's only been going within this century. It kind of got going a little bit in the 1990s, developed more towards the end, with people like Gary Francione theorizing about rights and welfare, this kind of stuff, and neo-welfarism, all this kind of stuff. But really, we've only just started doing this. So that should give us some hope, really, because in historical terms, what we're doing now has only just begun. And I think we can all agree that we've got a much more vegan world now than we did, say, 10 or 20 years ago. So thanks for listening, and I'd be very, very happy to take your questions.
Thanks so much, Roger. I do have a question from our audience. It says, I think some people are conflicted between promoting veganism and the innate need to feel socially accepted. How does one reconcile these feelings?
Yeah, I understand that. In fact, I used to say that the problem of veganism is not the ethics of it or the nutrition of it, it's the social side of it. And as a sociologist, I understand that. And so, yeah, we do have, we talked during this pandemic about herd immunity, but we do have like a bit of a herd mentality. Even advertising is based on that kind of, express your individuality by being the same as everybody else. We tend to think as a group, even though we also think as individuals. So I do understand the need to fit in. And from a sociological point of view, people are conformists, really. And so I do understand all of that. And ironically, one of the things that we're most conservative about, and there's lots of sociological research about this, are food choices. And so because the food aspect of veganism is fairly large, there's an important kind of dietary component of veganism, obviously, then people that start thinking about that, I'm not going to fit in, I'm going to be the odd one out and all the rest of it. So I understand that. And then they might get conflict with their family. So it is a problem, which is probably why vegans need support networks in order for them as new vegans. There's a great Facebook group called New Vegan Support, with about 20,000 people in it. And people ask questions or contact your local vegan groups. And then you can ask questions. But then you're asking questions, gaining information, but you're also getting a sense of community. So I understand the problem. The only way that we can solve it, I think, is to have an alternative vegan community that people can feel at home at, really. But it might not be their family, and it might not be the friends that they used to have. People might need to move on somewhat, and that could be a bit painful.
Thank you, Roger. I have another question from Wendy. Thanks, Roger. Why do you think that some of those in the movement now are so resistant to the interconnectedness of the oppression of other animal and human issues?
Well, I think, speaking as a sociologist now, I think that issue is answered by social movement theory, which basically says that when a movement grows bigger and bigger, well, one thing, it becomes more professionalized and starts to moderate, and that's the kind of thing that Corey Lee Wren, sociologist, talks about. But another thing is that a lot of people join a movement which doesn't necessarily have the same values of the people who started it. And I think that has certainly happened in the vegan movement in the last 10 years, I would say. And so, obviously, a social movement is not an homogeneous block, and everybody is not the same, but there is a shared set of values. And the shared set of values in our movement, in my experience at least, has been what you might call politically left-leaning, not necessarily on the extreme left and anarchists and communists, all that kind of stuff. And Steve Best talks about this quite well. He says, well, you can go to the anarchy, you can come to the left-leaning liberals, and that is our kind of block, tends to be. Now we've got a lot of people on the political right. You've even got things like Vegans for Trump, which for my generation, I've got to admit, is a very odd idea. That you can have kind of grab a pussy veganism just doesn't make sense to me. So I think that's the reason we've got a bit of an ideological battle going on for the heart and mind of the vegan movement now, I think.
Absolutely. Thank you. Checking if there's any other question. Maybe we can squeeze in one last question before we finish. Roger, what are some of the things that you recommend for people who are obviously aware that veganism is encompassing of animals, humans, and the earth? What are some of the things that we can do to kind of bring back the movement to this core?
Well, it's never completely gone away. It's just that some of the largest voices are the, you know, what I call the animals only people. And I should say in that respect, animals only and animals first is not the same thing. Animals first is actually fine. It fits in with the idea of focus and scope. So I don't have a problem with animals first. It's just that by limiting it, I get into trouble by this, but I say that the animals only folk are a bit like reducitarians. They're trying to slim down the meaning of veganism. Sometimes they'll actually quote the official definition, but only quote part of it and this kind of stuff, because there's only parts of it that they really agree with. And as soon as you start straying into areas that you could interpret as human issues, they don't like it. So their voice is growing, which means that our voice and our resistance has got to grow as well. It's the only way. And we need to have a dialogue in the movement. And I've seen people say, well, you know, I used to be animals only, and now I see the glory, if you like. I know it's a bit of a pompous thing to say, but you know, the wonderfulness of the scope of veganism and what it would mean if it came about, which has been reflected in those quotes. If we could bring about that, we would have a much better world. And so the idea that we can do it in isolation is not really workable. We've got to work, you know, I mean, our movement is made up of human beings. So we've got to work with human beings and got to find ways that our values can align with their values. If they have a liberation struggle, then we need to join it, and we need to convince them to join ours. That's really the only way it's going to work. So it's a question of whose voices are going to be heard, and the dialogue, the ongoing reflexive conversation that goes on in the social movement. That bit is normal. It's just that some voices are a little bit louder than others, usually white men, going back to that other slide. As I said that as a white man, of course.
Thank you. So we're out of time, actually, but we do have some questions, not in the Q&A, but they actually came to the chat, I think. So, Roger, after you turn off your camera, maybe you can answer those questions in a written format.
Yeah, I'll go to the chat. Yeah.
Awesome. Okay. Thank you so much for taking the time, Roger. Thank you for
thanks so much for inviting me. It's been a pleasure. So thanks very much. And so far, this conference has been wonderful.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Glad you like it.